Hello. You may have noticed that I haven't talked in David Starkey Talks much about the Tudors. What I really know about supposes have been, well, characteristic contrarianism and, to be truthful, a little bit of showing off that I do know about other things. But of course, I'm going to correct it. My intention, I'm not sure whether I will stick with it, is roughly once a week to do a video that will take us right through the life of the king that I've spent my life studying, Henry VIII. But first, I'm going to begin by looking at somebody else, because of course academic fashion, popular interest, has actually, in recent years, recent decades, shifted away very considerably from Henry VIII himself. Feminism has focused it on his wives. I've even written a big book about them. Also, of course, on his ministers, and especially Thomas Cromwell. This is partly because of the success of Hilary Mantel's triptych of novels, and behind her, of course, there's also the great figure of my own teacher, Geoffrey Elton, who spent his lifetime studying the works of Thomas Cromwell, his achievements, and arguing for his importance. There's in fact a very direct connection between Mantel and Elton. Believe it or not, Hilary Mantel's Thomas Cromwell is pretty much that of Geoffrey Elton, well, with a lot of adjectives. Because it's Geoffrey Elton who first pioneers the view that Cromwell isn't just this thuggish minister. He is a man of great achievement. He's above all a sort of modern man. Elton understood this very much to be about modernising government, but Mantel has presented it as a kind of modern man in general. And of course, opposed to Thomas Cromwell, there is that other Thomas More. In Mantel, Thomas More appears as the antithesis of Cromwell, the backward-looking man, dark, sexually driven, the villain, if you like, to Thomas More, to the villain, if you like, to Thomas Cromwell, the hero. That too actually is taken from one or two of Geoffrey Elton's essays, who again portrays Thomas More as driven by all kinds of complicated and suppressed sexual desires and all this kind of thing, of which there may be a bit of truth. But do remember, the contrast is a very awkward and, I think, unfortunate one. Both More and Cromwell aren't men looking back or men looking forwards. More isn't essentially medieval. Cromwell isn't essentially modern. They're both men, as we all are, of their own times. And it is important to realise also, Thomas More is a genius, and for all that one can say about Cromwell, he's not a genius. Thomas More is responsible for two of the great intellectual creations of humanity. One of them is Utopia, his fantasy of an ideal community. It, of course, gives a name to a complete literary genre, to a whole category of human activity and speculation. How many people is that true? But also his history of Richard III, which really isn't actually a history. It's more an extraordinary essay on the nature of English politics, of power, of personality. And of course, it leads directly to Shakespeare's great play. So, and finally, the end. Thomas More dies heroically, with a smile, and finally, I suppose, a kind of contempt for those who'd executed him. Thomas Cromwell, the night before his death, writes a letter to Henry, which ends with the plea, mercy, mercy, mercy. Who wouldn't? But it's not exactly heroic. Anyway, it's the life that we're dealing with, not the death. Once again, it's important, I think, to go back to fundamentals, to go back behind Elton, to go back behind Mantel. And indeed, back behind the wives. The problem is, in focusing on the wives, in attributing agency to them, in focusing on Henry's ministers, Wolsey and Cromwell, we do forget one absolutely fundamental fact. The women who became Henry's wives, the men, Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell, who became his ministers, matter only for one reason: that Henry, for whatever reason, chose them. In other words, the wives exist for Henry and are incomprehensible without him. The ministers exist for Henry and are incomprehensible without him. The minister is not there as an end in himself. The very word is a really difficult and dangerous word because, of course, it smacks of our modern notion of prime minister. It reeks of the person who is in charge, actually determines policy. That is not what a Tudor minister was. In fact, they don't use the word at all. The word is a reflection back, and it seriously distorts the relationship. The Tudor minister, if they'd called him anything, they would have called him a chief counsellor, is there to do one thing, and that is what Henry wants. The goals of policy are set by Henry. The minister's job is to do what the king wants. It's to fulfil the king's instructions and the king's wishes. And when, after he'd executed Cromwell, Henry rather regrets it and says, why did I get rid of the best servant, he used the word servant, that I'd ever had? It's this ability for Cromwell to do what he wants that strikes him. Nobody else could achieve what Henry wanted as quickly, as cleanly, as efficiently, usually as brutally. So that's what the minister is for. There's also, I think, a reason to use ministers at particular times. Ministers tend to be used, well, when there are rather dirty jobs to be done, difficult, unpopular jobs. When there are nice, big, popular jobs, like fighting a war, you tend to have a kind of collective government. You have government by the council, as at the beginning of Henry's reign, when he is the bright young man coming to the throne, intent on renewing the 100 Years' War with France, or at the end of the reign, after Cromwell's fall, in those last 6 or 7 years, which we forget about far too much. I think that's actually when the great achievements of Henry's reign are actually established. Once again, it's war, but firmly with the king in charge and ruling very directly and deliberately, and with all the experience now of his 30 years on the throne, it's Henry who's in charge. Henry who is visibly setting the course of policy, as of course he did throughout. But what Wolsey in his time and Cromwell in his time are there to do is to carry the can for unpopular policies, not nice big popular policies like war, but in Wolsey's case, he rises through war, but his ministry is effectively about normalising relations with France. In other words, that difficult, awkward, problematic thing to manage in an aristocratic warrior society, peace. Similarly, Cromwell's ministry is essentially about the securing of deeply unpopular things. The breakup of Henry's first marriage, his marriage to the deeply unpopular Anne Boleyn, and finally, the outrage, the destruction of the power of the Roman Church in England, that rupture with 500, 1,000 years of belief and practice. That's what Cromwell is there to do. And of course, when he's done it, well, he's thrown away like used tissue. That's the fate of the minister. The man himself, well, again, he is very extraordinary. We tend to focus on the humbleness of his origins, the fact that he's born to a kind of yeoman, publican, maybe a blacksmith in Putney, now a smart suburb, then a mere village on the edge of London, southern edge of London, southwestern edge of London. Yes, it is very unusual that you rise as far. He finishes up as Earl of Essex, the King's chief counsellor, vicegerent in spirituals, the King's deputy in the administration of the Church of England, Lord Great Chamberlain of England, Knight of the Garter, this astonishing cascade of titles. Very unusual for someone born so humbly. But I think that is in fact a kind of freak of the times. The Tudors and medieval kings often had ministers who were very humbly born. After all, the man through whose service Thomas Cromwell rises, Thomas Wolsey, was very humbly born too, though in a different part of the world, in Ipswich, in Suffolk. But of course, Wolsey was a churchman, and this rapid rise of humble boys through intelligence, through hard graft, through force of character, had traditionally taken place through the church. Because of course we need to remember something else. The whole administration of England up to, well, the decade that Thomas Cromwell dominates, the 1530s, is dominated by churchmen. All the great offices of state, apart from the Lord Treasurership, are held by churchmen. The Lord Chancellor is a churchman, the Lord Privy Seal is a churchman, the Secretary is usually a churchman. And this, curiously, we all know that the aristocracy is supposed to get very cross, indeed do get very cross with Wolsey and his arrogance, the whole business of the story that's told of Wolsey and the Duke of Buckingham. The Duke of Buckingham is holding a bowl of water for the king to wash his hands before dining. That's perfectly reasonable. The Duke is a Duke, but the King is a King. And Wolsey allegedly dips his hands in the water to wash his hands too, at which point the Duke is supposed to pour the bowl of water all over the Cardinal's stockings and shoes. He was not going to hold a bowl of water to an upstart like Wolsey. But that's actually rather an unusual attitude, because Wolsey is not only Archbishop of York, he is a cardinal, that's to say, a prince of the church. And the way the social mobility of these astonishingly talented lads who become Chancellor like Wolsey, Lord Privy Seal like Richard Fox, Secretary of State like so many of the others, the way it's handled is by the fact that they become, as a bishop, they become the equivalent, superior actually, of an earl, as an archbishop. You're the equivalent of a duke, and as a cardinal, well, you're quasi-royal. You are a prince of the church. And this enables the humbly born lad of talent to fit within the structure of aristocratic power. It's important to remember too, of course, that it was a double pyramid of power. If you look at where the House of Lords sits, you have the bishops on one side and the abbots on one side, and mostly on the other side you have the lay peerage. So there's a sense of the two elements. And the King's Council, the King's Old Council, not the Privy Council that emerges from the 1530s, the King's Old Council sits in exactly the same way, with the king in the centre, the churchman on one side and the layman on the other side. And it's not only true, in fact, in England, this business of using especially the position of cardinal as a means of making a relatively humbly born minister palatable in an intensely competitive aristocratic society. Well, of course, you find it in France too. I mean, all those great ministers of the Ancien Régime, Richelieu, Fénelon, and so on, Mazarin, they're all cardinals, which accommodates them within, however uncomfortably, within the aristocratic structure. Cromwell couldn't be so accommodated. But I would argue, in fact, that that last great outcrop of creations for him, just before his fall, as it happens, this great rise before the precipitate collapse of 1540, especially the earldom and the position of Lord Great Chamberlain, they're an attempt at accommodating him within the old aristocratic structure, but also within the new aristocratic structure, which Henry himself is actually creating to turn the rather awkward and sometimes edgy medieval English aristocracy into a service office-holding aristocracy that works for the Tudor monarchy. So, Cromwell then, not perhaps all that unusual in terms of the humbleness of his origins. Again, think of William Cecil and so on, and so many other of his successors. But at that point, it's rather normalised. What else is unusual about Cromwell? Well, again, we focus quite correctly on his astonishing youth, this ruffian period, as he calls it himself, the fact that he goes off and becomes a soldier in Italy and a kind of merchant in the Netherlands and so on, that he acquires excellent Italian, good Spanish, presumably Dutch, I don't know, a more than passable knowledge of Latin, decent French, very good French, and so on. Now, this continental experience does again seem to mark him out. His contemporaries in the 1530s, people like Bishop Bonner, the future Bishop Bonner, write to him as the Italian expert, asking for advice on improving their Italian. And this engagement with Italy is, of course, one of the absolutely fundamental things about the late Middle Ages, the 16th century. Italy, the pioneer of the re-engagement with the ancient world, of the classics, particularly the works of the Roman Republic, people like Cicero, and later on the great Greek political thinkers like Plato and Aristotle. This is the thing that helps to transform the nature of English politics and the old ideas of simple allegiance to the king into something nearer to our sense of commitment to a state and a collective identity, collective body, a collective idea of nationhood. So all of that there, but is it really all that unusual? Well, it is for a layman. It is for a layman who rises as high politically as Cromwell does. But it wasn't at all unusual for the kind of people that Cromwell actually replaces. If we look at the kind of people who rose to the top of the church in the late Middle Ages, in the period which I regard the reign of Henry VII as belonging to the late Middle Ages, more or less, the declining Middle Ages in England. If you look at the people who rise to the top of the church there, they are very often soaked in Italy. One of the most interesting figures is a man called Thomas Langton, who would, if Richard III had won, which he very nearly did at Bosworth, would have been the first minister of Richard III. And Langton, I'm going to do a whole video on him because he's a very interesting man. Langton spends 10 years in Italy, in Padua, in Bologna, in Venice, in Rome, perfecting his knowledge of Italian, perfecting his Latin, perfecting his skills in canon law, his contacts at the papal court. Again, the man who becomes Henry's secretary in the 1520s also has a remarkably broad experience in Italy and full fluency in Italian and so on. So it's the churchmen that had careers like Cromwell and are then displaced by Cromwell the layman. In other words, what is peculiar about Cromwell is really part of what we can call the process of laicization, the shift from a royal service which is dominated by churchmen, which in most ways, certainly administratively, it had been before the 1530s, into one which becomes almost exclusively lay. And Thomas Cromwell is the great pioneer of that. He is the moment, I suppose, of transition. What are the other things that are attributed to Cromwell? Well, again, I mentioned this point about minister, I suppose the sense of policy. Again, it's very important to understand with Cromwell that brilliantly intelligent though he was, widely read, thoughtful, and clearly having the strongest opinions on policy, he doesn't make it. And nor is there all that much sign, I would argue, of a high level of originality. This again is something that's very often attributed to Cromwell, both by Mantell in her way and by Elton very much in his way. For example, the great key policy decision of this period, the means to the divorce, the idea of the royal supremacy, this is not Cromwell. The idea of the royal supremacy, its grounding in history and pseudo-history and canon law and pseudo-theology and real theology, all of this is worked out by a team set up by Henry, headed partly by Anne Boleyn's father, also very much at the intellectual side by Thomas Cranmer, and by Edward Fox and so on. This team is responsible, set up immediately in the aftermath of the failure of the divorce trial at Blackfriars. So it's set up from the autumn of 1529 onwards, and it's a think tank. It's a think tank centred on a new reformed royal library, a royal library which up to that point is really a show library. You know, it's lovely, luxurious books with lots of pictures in them and silk ribbons hanging from them, is replaced with a real working library. And it's a real working library in which the books are given Arabic catalogue numbers are arranged alphabetically. Important quotations from them are extracted. In other words, it's a working library which is the basis for a kind of think tank. And the think tank comes up with a document called the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, the sufficiently comprehensive or copious collection, which argues the case for the royal supremacy in neo-historical terms. That is long before Cromwell's rise in the royal service. Nor again is there any evidence that there's anything, as Elton claims, for example, anything particularly unusual in the use of Parliament to force through either the divorce or the royal supremacy. The years after 1529 are not years without a policy, as Elton calls them. They're years in which, well, you've got a Parliament, but you couldn't get the legislation through Parliament. I mean, the notion that you would drive the divorce through Parliament is there right from the beginning. When the Reformation Parliament, the so-called Reformation Parliament, is summoned in 1529, we have poor Catherine of Aragon. You know, Parliament's been summoned, they're going to force my divorce through. The reason they don't, of course, is that they couldn't. You couldn't have got it through Parliament. There would have been too much resistance in Parliament. And it's Cromwell's job, above all, by browbeating the resistance of the Church, which equally, of course, diminishes the resistance of the House of Lords, since the bishops and the abbots dominate the largest group in the Lords. It's Cromwell's browbeating of the Church, deliberately and with sustained brutal effect in 1530, 31, 32, that finally opens the doors to Henry's divorce and to the royal supremacy. So it's not, do we have Parliament? Do we use Parliament as a matter of principle? It's a simple practical question. Can we get it through? A question that everybody dealing with the Parliament has to face, from governments from Edward III to Boris Johnson. How do you get something through Parliament? You cannot simply, as we've discovered, whip it through. You have to make sure that there is a vote for it, otherwise you are lost. And one of Cromwell's great jobs was what the 19th century called a parliamentary undertaker. He knew how to get things through Parliament by fair means and by foul. The kind of pressures that Cromwell brought to bear on the Church were, of course, primarily financial. He uses the device of so-called praemunire, that is, the charge that the Church had been complicit in the illegitimate assumption of legatine papal power by Cardinal Wolsey, to impose vast fines on it. That's the great instrument of pressure. And this takes us to another very important aspect of Cromwell, which I think is too little thought about. How did Cromwell actually get into the king's service? Why did Henry pick up on him? Why was Henry so convinced that he was the right man for the job? Well, famously, of course, Cromwell's transition to Henry's service comes about at the moment of Wolsey's fall. There's the famous scene reported by Wolsey's gentleman usher, by George Cavendish, in the extraordinary life that he composes of Wolsey, of Cromwell pacing up and down, recognising that the fall of his master Wolsey could bring down everything, and taking the resolution that he would win or lose, that he would approach the king, that he would risk everything to save his life and everything that he'd achieved. And of course he does that. And what Cromwell does very straightforwardly is to use Wolsey's wealth first to try to bribe those attacking Wolsey, the Boleyns, the nobility, the inner members of Henry's court, Henry himself, to use Wolsey's vast accumulated wealth and resources to bribe Wolsey's enemies, to try to be a bit nicer to the fallen Wolsey, to the fallen minister. But he also, of course, in being able to turn on these vast floods of cash that came from Wolsey's accumulated wealth, does very much attract attention to himself, And go to Cromwell, he can get you a nice pension from the bishopric of Winchester or whatever. And he also, I think, establishes something else. It establishes what is undoubtedly the case, that Cromwell is very good with money. His principal activity in Wolsey's service had been the dissolution of the small monasteries that were used to fund Wolsey's great colleges at Oxford, still there as Christ Church, though intended to be called Cardinal College, and now disappeared, the feeder school that was going to be a kind of Eton or Winchester to Cardinal College, the college, the school that he founded also at his birthplace of Ipswich. And they were sustained. They were to be sustained, they were to be endowed out of the lands of these confiscated monasteries. So Cromwell, the expert lawyer, conveyancer, and of course accumulator of loot and money, was very, very good at this sort of job. And his first employment with Henry is similarly financial. He seems to emerge as a stopgap solution to what I think, in fact I'm sure, is a genuine fiscal crisis. Wolsey thought in 1527, when he'd done the great deal with France in the treaties of Amiens, that England would never need another parliament. What happens is that the King of France, who has been captured by the Holy Roman Emperor, by Charles V at the Battle of Pavia, and ransomed, the England goes into a compact with Francis I. It offers him support. It completely, of course, reverses the policy of fighting him, and it offers him support for which, of course, Francis pays hugely by assuming the vast debts which the Habsburgs, not only Charles V himself, but his father Maximilian, had incurred to the Tudors, going right back to the days of Henry VII, who, as I've been able to demonstrate recently, the vast bulk of the enormous land revenues and the more importantly the fines and the various sums that was screwed out of people for royal favour by Empson and Dudley, the vast bulk of that cash goes directly in vast loans, bribes really, to the Habsburgs, and this accumulated stuff, well over $1 million in their money, which is a vast sum. That whole debt is assumed by Francis I, and he agrees to pay it down in yearly instalments, which have made Henry, as Wolsey says, a very rich king and have no more need to call parliaments. But of course, the tensions that follow, and the tensions which particularly follow Henry's decision to divorce his first wife, to break with Rome and so on, give France the opportunity first to make the payments irregular, and then when France, also playing a clever diplomatic game, when France decides to support Henry's wish for a divorce. That's the famous meeting between Francis I and Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn at Boulogne in 1532, the moment at which, on the return voyage, almost literally, Henry and Anne first fully sleep together. That decision of Francis I to support Henry is, of course, the vital guarantee to England that they won't face a united continent opposed to them, that the Emperor Charles V will not be able to intervene on behalf of his aunt Catherine of Aragon, and it has to be paid for. And it is paid for effectively by letting Francis off that gigantic debt. And this is a huge problem, because if you look at the royal finances in the late 1520s, you see that they're essentially dependent on the French pension, those sums that are paid under the various treaties, and especially the Treaty of 1527. You can tell this because the sums that are dealt with are French crowns. It's the gold that's handed over in Calais. This, of course, makes the royal finances unbelievably fragile, and from 1532, well, risks real bankruptcy. And it's Cromwell's job to find replacements. And you can see Cromwell managing these private finances, the things that are known as the King's privy coffers, from which Henry is living hand to mouth at this point. And it is ultimately, I would argue, why in the 1530s you have to begin the process of massive confiscations from the church. Parliament is not going to supply huge sums of money unless you have a war, but you can't fight a war, you don't want to fight a war, you want instead to impose a great change of religious policy. That needs peace, and to do it you need money, and the only source of money is, well, confiscation of church property, which duly happens. But I think you can see the forerunners of this in the way Cromwell rises through the royal service. So he rises, in other words, not as an ideas man. He rises as a financial agent, as a doer, as an organizer, as an accountant, as an administrator, all of that, which he is very, very good at indeed. This is very much, it's backstairs stuff. Those privy coffers, they feed into the work of the privy purse as well. This secret private structure of finance that Henry VIII operates, which of course is operated literally out of his privy chamber, out of that third inner department of the royal household. And this again is a striking thing about Cromwell. He'd been in Wolsey's household in the very last stage of Wolsey's government. Wolsey had infiltrated servants of his own, like Thomas Heneage and John Russell, into the king's private service. Cromwell benefits from that fact. He's really one of them. He rises through the inner court. He rises through, literally, the back stair. So that's the sort of feeling that I have about Cromwell. Now, famously, of course, Cromwell is then and now seen as one of the key figures in the more than drift towards a kind of Protestantism, or at least a rejection of many aspects of Catholicism in the 1530s. Yes, this is true. Cromwell is indeed made the king's deputy for the royal supremacy. He is made vicegerent in spirituals. But again, we have to be very careful. Cromwell is a layman. Henry is very aware of that fact. Henry, of course, sees himself as more than a layman. Henry, when he assumes the headship of the church, he has a title which many would consider blasphemous. Supreme head on earth, only under Christ. Henry sees himself genuinely as a an English pope. So Cromwell, as a layman, he can't really step into that. As vicegerent in spirituals, he is really responsible for the administration of the church, not for the doctrine of the church. And when it actually comes to royal doctrine, what is very striking is how jealously Henry keeps this to himself, how little direct part Cromwell plays in it, and particularly at key moments when famously Cromwell wants to ally England with the Protestant Germans, with the Lutheran Germans, the Schmalkaldic League. Henry, of course, hates Luther hates Henry, and you get Henry directly supervising the whole question, could England enter into a relationship with the Schmalkaldic League, which wouldn't only be a diplomatic relationship, it would have to be also an agreement on the broad outlines of faith. And Henry takes personal charge of it and delegates the task, as he usually does delegate tasks, but he doesn't delegate it to Cromwell. He takes charge of it when king and minister are separate. The crucial role of the royal progress, the minister essentially in London, in Westminster, running the machinery of government, just as Wolsey had done in similar circumstances, and the king off hunting and enjoying himself, and using the time to think and reflect and to take the counsel of a man who was Cromwell's absolute antithesis, Cuthbert Tunstall, the Bishop of Durham, and the choice of Tunstall to supervise the whole pondering, was it possible, was it desirable to enter into this combination of a diplomatic and a confessional relationship with the Schmalkaldic League. This reflects, of course, things that go back long, long before Cromwell. Cromwell would have known, however, that Cuthbert Tunstall, as a young, brilliant young man, had actually been the English ambassador to the Diet of Worms, the famous diet at which Luther had declared, "Here I stand, I can do no other," except unfortunately, Tunstall had to leave the Diet just before that great moment takes place. Otherwise, we would have his description of it. But what we do have, and it's quite astonishing, we have Cuthbert Tunstall's wonderful dispatches from the Diet up to that point, including his accounts of Luther's latest books, summarising in the Babylonian captivity, summarising Luther's astonishing attack on the seven sacraments, the Catholic doctrine of the sacraments, and that account leads directly to Henry's great riposte, the assertion of the seven sacraments, the thing of which, of course, he became rather embarrassed when he decides to break with Rome. But Tunstall, as it were, in the back of Henry's mind, in those very Henry's extraordinarily effective memory cells, he has an astonishing memory. Tunstall is banked there as going right back to his experience of the Diet of Worms, his role in formulating the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum. That's the work that gets Henry the title from the Pope of Defender of the Faith. It's to this man, not to Cromwell, that Henry turns at that great moment of crisis with, shall we go in with the Schmalkaldic League or shan't we? And of course, the result of consulting Tunstall and Henry's own prejudices is no, they don't, which I think effectively seals Cromwell's broader fate. So Cromwell not as central in religious policy, the formulation of religious policy, as perhaps he's thought, and having to come up against these deep prejudices, the deep, irremovable prejudices of Henry, which also, of course, can attach themselves to other figures like Tunstall. Finally, what about the business of government and governmental reform itself? Famously, in Elton, Cromwell is seen as the author of a bureaucratic revolution. This is a rather odd notion. It's taken partly from medieval English history. Much more importantly, it's taken from Max Weber, the German sociologist, which is the idea that you replace charismatic government, the rule of one, by rule of many, by rule of a bureaucracy, by rule of the expert. And because of the changes which take place in the administration of finance, things like the creation of the Court of Augmentations and allegedly the developments of the secretaryship and of the Privy Council, in the period when Cromwell is in office, Elton claims that this sort of shift takes place. So government ceases to be as personal, as direct in the hands of the king, and as concentrated in the hands of the king's household. That's the equivalent to the kind of Downing Street staff, those figures in the Privy Chamber that I was talking about, as it had been before. Now, this seems to me, and Elton was my teacher, fundamentally and absolutely wrong. I remember, even as a research student, being insolent enough to ask my great teacher, I think he was probably knighted and Regius Professor at that point, when exactly did he think Thomas Cromwell explained to Henry VIII that Henry was now redundant? I answered my own question about 2 days before he was executed by a probably inexperienced executioner with a rather blunt axe. In other words, the idea of Henry being displaced as the centre of government by something machinery set up by Cromwell is simply preposterous. As silly as to think of Cromwell as the formulator of policy and not Henry. And here again, you see, I think it's important that we look at how on earth these kind of ideas float around. How is it that very intelligent historians describe Henry as a bit of a booby or a kind of sports fanatic, what's the word I want, sociopath? How do they come up with these phrases? Well, of course, Henry is exactly the kind of sporting jock which tended, I imagine, to bully spectacle-wearing historians when they were at school. So you can see why he's not much liked. But think about it. The minister exists for the king, not the other way round. Henry is the most kingly of English kings. And can we also, when we're busy denigrating his talents, can we think of what it says about somebody, that he's capable of choosing servants like Wolsey and Cromwell and trusting them? All modern theories of management argue that the real test of leadership is the ability to delegate and the quality of the people to whom you choose to delegate. Henry, delegating to Wolsey and delegating to Cromwell, would score pretty highly on that index of management. And indeed, I would turn all the changes that happen under Henry VIII round. It seems to me that the changes that happen under Henry don't exclude the king as a person from government. On the contrary, they actually give him new instruments of government. And far from excluding the place, the palace, the household where the king is, they actually make the palace the new centre of government. And here again, it's important to look at Henry as a builder. Cromwell always complains that Henry is this prodigious builder, and why does he spend so much money on building, and wouldn't it be sensible if he built less and then he'd have more money in his coffers? But what Henry famously does is to leave the Palace of Westminster, where Parliament, the law courts, exchequer, the administration was, he leaves that unrestored after the Great Fire of 13, which had built out the private section of the palace, and after a period of time when, without a home in Westminster or London, he had really ruled England from Greenwich. With Wolsey's fall in 1529, he takes over Wolsey's great town palace of Whitehall, York Place as it was then called, and rebuilds it into this huge central Westminster, the two cities, London and Westminster, the central Westminster residence that stretches, from the modern Ministry of Defence, the river, right across into St James's Park on the site of the Horse Guards and everything else there, with the tiny narrow street, which is now called Whitehall, that was then called King Street, running in the middle, and the palace structures carried on two great bridges over the street. And that palace, the Palace of Whitehall, becomes the first place that the king lives permanently. It's the first palace to be left fully furnished all the time with magnificent treasures, because the king actually lives there pretty much in a modern sense. But it also becomes the centre of the new instruments of government. And those instruments of government are the secretaryship, which Cromwell had held and did so much to shape. And finally, the position of the council, the Privy Council. Look at that term, Privy Council, private council. We actually know where the Privy Council meets, and we know where the Secretary of State has his rooms. It's not, along with the rest of the administration, in the old palace of Westminster. That was where the council had always met, in the Star Chamber. Instead, the Secretary and the Privy Council, they meet in the heart of the new palace. They actually meet in that private section of the palace off the Privy Gallery, with the council chamber being pretty much opposite the King's bedchamber. The Secretary again has got one of the best rooms in the bridge that carries the Privy Gallery over King Street. So the Secretary and the Privy Council aren't away from the King. They're right next to the King. In fact, we know that when the clerks work for the Secretary, they've got to be very careful that they don't actually disturb the King in his bedchamber. They're right next door. So this is government at the heart of the palace. This is government which Cromwell helps to develop, but it's government that's created for Henry's purpose. And it develops fully after Cromwell's death. The setting up, the formation, the formalisation of the Privy Council only takes place after Cromwell's death. The machinery of its clerk, the machinery of its new minute book, they're all set up then, and they're set up directly and supervised by Henry himself. And Henry manages his own council in that last decade of the reign. In other words, there is a Tudor Revolution in government, but it's not carried out by Cromwell. Cromwell is one of those who works towards it, but he does it only as part of his general acting as an agent of Henry. The supervising force, the directing force, the purposive force is the king himself. The Tudor Revolution is the opposite of what Geoffrey Elton thought. It's a revolution that gives the king in person, new instruments of government that make him directly much more powerful, and also, of course, set up the potential of conflict between the old instruments of royal government in the Palace of Westminster, Parliament, the law courts, Exchequer, Chancery, and so on, and these new instruments of government that reflect the direct personal power of the king. But that's a bigger story that we'll address when we look more fully at the reign of Henry VIII and the Tudors in general and in particular.